Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hello and welcome back to the Thursday edition of Mythic Mind, although I am posting this a day late, so sorry about that. But on the Thursday edition of Mythic Mind, we're currently going through Josh Traylor's Paradise Lost course, which he taught for Mythic Mind last year. And this time we're getting into Book 5, and so I hope you enjoy.
Alright, so good day, everybody. This is the overview for Book 5, so we are about halfway through the class now. As I had said on the chat, we are going to be combining Books 7 and 8 into one class session, and then Books 11 and 12 into one class session. So it'll be 10 weeks instead of 12. Those books definitely kind of run together in a certain kind of way where they're best read together, and some of it's just time constraints as well. So hope you can forgive me for that. I know I said 12 originally, but nevertheless, we are halfway through the class now, and we are in the Garden of Eden, so we mostly got Satan's perspective on that last time, whereas this time we are going to spend more time with Adam and Eve. We're going to, of course, Satan's kind of always rearing his ugly head around the garden at this point in the narrative, but we're also going to get the perspective of God a little bit, but also that of Raphael as well. He's going to be a new character introduced here, and he's going to be essentially Adam's teacher, but also their guide and their the person who comes to warn them of what's coming from Satan. So picking up from where we left off, so Eve awakens in the garden, and if you remember at the end of Book 4, there's a scene where Satan whispers something basically into Eve's ear as she's sleeping, right? He kind of, in some sort of sorcery type of way, puts some sort of dream into her in a way. And so at the beginning of Book 5, we're going to see that Eve, she awakens in the garden, and pretty early on in the book, she's going to tell Adam about the dream, basically, as in a healthy sense and a good picture of marriage for us, as Eve is disturbed, and so she goes and tells her other half, her husband, about like what's disturbing her, about problems. In a good marriage, in a good healthy marriage, there's open discussion and dialogue about struggles and thoughts, and there's really a strong cohesive unity, and I think there's a beautiful picture that we see in that there. And there's this phrase said that says, "Damp horror chills at such bold words," and I think that really encapsulates how Eve actually feels about this, where she's actually horrified in this, so it's more of a nightmare than it is really a dream at the end of the day. And you may ask yourself how Eve can have a nightmare in Eden, right? If it's unfallen, should she even have the capacity to be afraid? Isn't that something that would come with sin? And you might say that no, like, fear can be healthy, and maybe there's supposed to be a sense of fear that did exist before the fall in a way. Maybe that's a good thing to be afraid of Satan, because if he's going to come and try to deceive you, there's a level to perhaps where fear should be healthy in that sense, right? Where you should be scared of once the most powerful angel. He's fallen now, and he's coming after you to try to basically ruin your life and all of the existence of your ancestors in a way as well. So I think there's validity to the fear there. But also, let's take a dive into an Old English word here and get some context for kind of understanding what Mild may be influenced by here. But so the word I want you to hone in on is a word that we've all heard before, but fantasy. Fantasy being spelled with PH in this sense, I believe, but it's the Old English word for imagination. And so basically we take in images with the sensory data, the five senses, and then our reason works on the images, and then we form imaginations in the sleep. That's sort of like an Aristotelian psychological way of understanding this. And so in the pre-Lapsarian world, the brain still processes things, right? Like, they're not just spirits floating around in the heavens somewhere. But I mean, Adam and Eve, like they have a body and they have a soul, right? Like they're not just soul, they're not just body, but they have psyches, right? They have brains, they have neurological processes. They're not reduced to that. They're not hyper focused on that like a lot of moderns would be, but they still have it, right? And these faculties still work in a way. And so it kind of makes sense that strange dreams would um, at least be plausible in imagining the prelapsarian world. But their dreams aren't they're not going to be marred by sin, I think is the real key here. So whereas we maybe in a sense can sin in our dreams, I'm not sure where to go with that, but um their dreams can't be marred by sin because sin and death haven't entered into the world yet. So it's just going to be different. But I don't think all these things imply some sort of inconsistency with the fall itself. And so just kind of like looking at like modern psychology a little bit too. So Macrobius's commentary on a text called "The Dream of Scipio" is extremely influential on modern psychology. Freud actually slammed Macrobius quite a bit, but he also stole his ideas. So I guess Freud just being Freud in a sense. But there's this formula in Macrobius on really when it is appropriate to tell fables and when it is not appropriate to tell fables. And in this time, fables are really just their narratives about spiritual subjects and spiritual matters in a sense. So you might think of um, like a 19th century fable or like some Germanic folklore or something like that, and they're often just narratives about certain spiritual topics. And so they really give us this base point about transcending the plot in which narrative presumes time in a sense. But in the Middle Ages, Christians will talk about how Christ actually transcended the very plot of history and of itself. So for Macrobius, you could use fables to talk about angels, but you could not use them to talk about transcendent deities in a way. So perhaps there's some sort of connection here with Milton that could be worked out and teased out, and we can discuss that on the Wednesday night class if necessary, or if desired, I should say. So when we really get to kind of the crux of what Satan's doing in this dream, as Eve explains it, Satan's selling point is really that you're happy, great, but you can even be happier than this. You can be much happier than this if you would simply just partake of the forbidden fruit, right? Like you're filled with knowledge, joy, and goodness, but you'll be filled even more so with knowledge, joy, and goodness. How much more so, right? Like that's what he's selling around. It's like you think this is great, just imagine how much greater it would be. Like that's the bliss, the sublime that you would experience is so far beyond this if you would just partake of the fruit. And that's the seed that he's planting in her mind, right? We all may have these things where we've had a conversation with somebody in the past, and I think this can be I think this is neutral in of itself, and it can be good or bad depending on what the motive is and what the purpose is. But a good educator will really ask you some probing questions and get you to think about things that sort of gnaw at you afterwards for a while. You may have had a great conversation with a friend about some idea, and I know I've experienced this where I'm up half the night, if not later, thinking about it. That hasn't happened necessarily recently, but when I remember being 18, 19, 20 years old and coming to challenging ideas for the first time and having those struggles, right? So there's a sense where Satan's pointing this idea, but this, in this sense, is absolutely not a good thing, and that's clear as day for us. So he's pointing this idea, though, and that's going to be just gnawing at Eve for the rest of the way until the fall, basically, and then she's obviously going to, have to lament and mourn that after, in a way, that she did fall for his deceitful tricks. So we might even be able to say at this point that Satan is beginning with his whispering of the fall into Eve's ears. So like those whisperings, they have an echo in her mind in a sense, right? It's going to keep on going and keep on going, and this idea is unfortunately in there, and perhaps there's a way where Eve can get it out of her head, but I don't think that she does, based on the fact that she does fall 4 books from now. So that's really like the idea that Satan's getting at. He's planting that in our mind here, and um, basically it's you're happy, but what if you could be even happier, right? And I think there's a parallel to postmodernism here in a sense. Really, the postmodern manifestation within the like the consumeristic American dream, especially like looking back at like this was a little bit before I was born, but like the 1980s. If you see the Wall Street movies and things like that, but it's just manifested in our culture everywhere, right? Where it's like contentment is really not um, taught or practiced in a lot of people. Like it's always about getting more. That whole ideology. It's always about um, it's kind of grounded in discontentment in a way. It's always about you could always have another promotion. You could always upgrade your car. You could always buy a boat. You know, if you have a boat, you could buy a second boat. You have a vacation home up north, great. Why not get one in like California or some tropical island or something, or like off the coast of Florida or wherever, right? Or just have two houses up north or something, or up in. I'm talking up north because I'm from Michigan, by the way. I just realized that. But up north, just being I'm from the bottom of the state of Michigan. Up north is basically way up there by like Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, even like Lake Superior. Look at a map, you'll know what I'm talking about. But you could always beef up your 401k more, right? There's these ideas where it's just this progress, 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 just beaten into us over and over again. And the secret to this is really just being content in a lot of ways, right? Like I love reading the lives of some of the different monastic figures throughout church history, or even just somebody like Saint John Chrysostom, who was just really just preaching contentment rather than avarice and greed and just continuing to possess things. And there's a sense here where Satan is doing this, right? Where he's just like, keep pursuing, you're happy, but don't be content with that. Be happy, or like go find it. And of course, what he's selling them is not happiness. It is not, in Aristotle's words, eudaimonia in a way. But he's actually leading them down a road where they're going to be miserable. They're not going to be content, and they're going to ruin that for all of humanity. So there's a lot that we can glean out of there, as Satan's always, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, but maybe in a way for better understanding ourselves. He's always probing into our thoughts, I think, as we read Paradise Lost. It just keeps coming up. So Adam's response here, really, he's going to say that, reason can govern all of the lesser faculties, right? So this really is like, I think it's Platonic in a sense, where so Plato had these three parts of the soul. There was the upper part, which is the logistikon, which is the calculating or the thinking, and the middle portion was the thematicon, which is the angered or the riled, which does not care about truth in of itself, but the appearance of truth and perhaps how you are perceived by other people. And by the way, just noting this too, in the classical tradition, there's no specific word in Greek or Latin for emotion as we would understand it in a modern sense. It's really a modern psychological concept in of itself too. But rather they would talk about particularities of emotion, right? So like anger, joy, things like that. And pathein or passions are always negative in these contexts as well. Like they're considered pathologies of a complex system of the soul. So you think of like the seven capital vices or the seven deadly sins, lust, greed, pride, wrath, like being four of them. And basically these things they put you in bondage and slavery, as like just to basically passions in a sense, whereas they're disorders of your soul. Whereas if you can govern them properly with reason, they can be well ordered and properly ordered in the hierarchy of being, and not be cancerous to your soul, but they often are. And so that's, in a sense, like, they're unfallen. So Adam's basically saying, like, he's like, hey, like, you can still choose to do this, right? You can still have by reason, by the logistikon, you can properly order the thematicon and the lower regions, or the epithematicon, which is the desiring or the appetitive. And you might think of, like, C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man here, where it's like, you've got, like, the reason, the head, you've got the appetites and like the stomach, the belly, and then you've got like the chest. And he was always talking about, really in his first lecture, first part of that book, the men without chests, right? It's like, what are they? Like, they're missing this middle section, that really puts them as a complete whole being in a sense, right? Like you can't just be a brain on a stick, you can't just be a slave to your appetites, and most modern people are that in a sense, right? But that's really, I think, what Adam's getting at in a sense here is he's saying that um, we need to be properly ordered in our souls. And again, remember, they have the free will to choose this, whereas um, in our day and age, we're bent, right? Like our will is bent towards sin, and um, we are regenerated by, and this is like how Milton would think of it. Certainly, is like when we are regenerated or we are born again in Christ. The will changes to it in a sense where we can choose sin or not choose sin. And Augustine also talks about these things as well. But it's different in an unfallen world, right? Like they have the freedom to obey or to not disobey, and there's a sense where that's like more libertarian, where they have like more absolute freedom than we ever would. So just keeping those ideas in mind as you read this. But nevertheless, Adam and Eve, we get more glimpses into their life, and they pray to overcome temptation, right? We even see this like with Jesus in Matthew 4, like when in which is actually like the foundational text for Paradise Regained, as I've said before. But we see this with Jesus, where he's rebuking Satan with Scripture, and as he like would rebuke the temptations of Satan with Scripture, Adam and Eve, they pray and they overcome temptation, recover from the temptation that Satan has brought about through prayer in a sense here. So that's kind of a reminder for us, even though we are fallen, we should do the same thing, and we still can do the same thing, right? It's just, unfortunately, it's not as it should be, as all unfallen things are not as they should be. So we get this imagery too here of prelapsarian worship here, and there's really this poetic nature here in Milton. For Milton, poetry is really ultimately about praise. It's especially about rendering the praise due to God. And this is going to be very, very much inspired by the Hebrew Psalms. So it's like the heavens declare the glory of God. That's going to be like a backdrop here. But also, really, you read the entirety of Psalms 104 and 148, and they really run parallel to this sense of praise here, and how, like, we as humans, we are created in the image of God. God is, in some way, shape, or form, manifest in nature in some general revelatory sense. And our senses can perceive that. There's something we experience there with nature, but it ultimately rolls back up to God in a way. And George MacDonald, in his essay on William Wordsworth, talks about this a lot. And one thing he says is, in quote, "And so it must be, because if man be the child of God, would he not feel to be out of his element if he lived in a world which came not from the heart of God, but only from his hand?" So that's really like tying in with, like, he's saying that the love of God is really manifest in all of nature. Like, and this is really, that quote has to be understood that he's pushing back on really the deism of the century before him. So the 18th century, whereas he lived in the 19th century. And those ideas still being manifested his day, right? Where George MacDonald was in that romantic tradition. He was Victorian area, so writing really in the generation after like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and all of them. But really, he's saying this idea where it's like, it's not just a God just rationally created things, but his love is also embedded into nature in a way. And so I think this is part of Milton, in a sense, who was influential on all of those romantics and Victorians, especially the best of them. And there's a sense where he's painting a beautiful picture with nature. It's not just nature and scientific, but nature praises God in a sense in its own right, and like we should praise God through nature in a way as well. But what do we notice here about unfallen worship in Eden? There's kind of a sense of routine here, where Adam and Eve's like, they get up, they do the same thing. It's kind of liturgical in a sense, where there's a pattern and there's timing to it. Like, it's not just willy-nilly and just kind of just like impulsive in the moment, but they seem to like do the same thing every day. And I think there is like a liturgical quality to that, which I'm not entirely sure how Milton felt overall about liturgy. He was certainly not pro-Anglican, and is very anti-Roman Catholic in a lot of ways, but I'm not sure if he upheld liturgy and was for it in his own congregationalistic sense or not. But it's kind of like brings about the question of, is this the way that worship ought to be now, or does worship just change after the fall? And there's a sense here too where we know that fallen man cannot come up with amazing, eloquent things um, as easily, I think, as they could in the fall. I think that part of it is like we have to labor just to come up, labor to have nice things, labor to have good things, and to maintain and preserve good things in a totally unique and different way than Adam and Eve would have had to before the fall. But we get this prayer really at the end of this sequence, and I think it really runs a lot of parallels to the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, where it just like starts with God, and you kind of get like this senses of just them making these petitions or requests for God just providing for them throughout the day and the day's labor and things, and then they close and they go about their day, right? Like that's I uh, I do the Lord's Prayer with my children every day, though they can at their age they can't really understand it, but good habit, and I think that's um, perhaps Milton did the same thing in his day. I'm not sure, but there's definitely like a liturgical quality in all of this. Not sure exactly how that's influenced by Milton's life and belief, though. So moving on to there, we finally get to Raphael. So Raphael is introduced by God, where he is speaking to him, and we might say, why Raphael, and why did God send Raphael in a sense instead of just talking to them directly himself? Um, and like we see this in Scripture. So Adam and Eve don't really talk to the angels, but they talk directly to God in a way. And where Raphael ties in here, so he's only a character in the Book of Tobit, which is in the Roman Catholic Deuterocanon that was affirmed in the mid 16th century at the Council of Trent. But of course, Tobit was read throughout the church, at least by some church leaders and in some regions of the church. But and Milton certainly would have read these things, and perhaps he was just comfortable with using that. But we have to understand here, in a sense, the hierarchy of how this works as well. So, in Pseudo Dionysius' celestial hierarchy, there's three different hierarchies, or kind of like sub hierarchies within the overall angelic hierarchy. And there's really the higher orders, the middle orders, and the lower orders. And I mentioned there's with the Platonic view of the soul, there being the higher, the middle, and the lower. Um, Pseudo Dionysius was very Platonic in his own right, and perhaps that's why he chose to categorize them in this triadic way, in a sense. And maybe the triadic nature of that has something to do with being made in the image of God in a way as well, right? You see images of triads or threes in a lot of different things, like in music. Like Dante does this a lot. He plays around with Trinitarian form in his poetry. So that's just there's some connections there. But so for Dionysius, the higher orders, they worship and contemplate the divine essence. You kind of think of um, like the singing, like of the holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. In like Revelation, I think that's chapter 4 or 5, not towards the beginning of Revelation somewhere. But this is the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones are these three angelic orders, and that's in order, by the way. So seraphim are at the top of the top hierarchy, so really the highest of the angels. Then the middle orders, they maintain the order of creation, so they're at work in creation, but they're not really interacting with humans as much. They more are working to preserve creation itself. Perhaps they're involved in spiritual warfare in a sense as well. I'm not sure what Dionysius thought of that, but this is where we have the dominions, the virtues, and the powers in that order. And then the lower orders these are the ones that actually interact with humans and work out God's will in human history and in earthly creation. So they're not just preserving creation in some mystical and spiritual way, but they actually interact with human work and maybe even will take on bodies at times. And you might think of like the Maiar and like Tolkien's work and the Silmarillion and like some of like the wizards as well. But here you have like the principalities, the archangels, and then just the ordinary angels. The angels as being like kind of a broad sense for just the lowest type of angel. It can be interchangeable, but archangels, this is like really what we're honing in on here, as like we see people like Michael, we see people like Gabriel in Scripture, and um, basically Dionysius says that the angels are ministering to those below them in a way in a hierarchy. And so down the hierarchy from God all the way to like the angels and the archangels, where they connect with humanity in a sense. So we have this platonic hierarchy in a way where it's like God's at the top, and then we have like the angels, and they're a hierarchy down to humanity, and humanity even has a hierarchy in its own way as well, where it's like man is the leader of the household, and only males will be leaders in the church properly, as like elders, pastors, bishops, etc., deacons, other offices, and basically, so there's kind of like get this hierarchical sense here, and so this is where Raphael connects to us. Is basically a long story, very short, and it's possible to consider and interesting to consider that Raphael might have been sent because perhaps he went through something similar, right? Like Raphael is going to give us an account of what happens when Satan rebels, right? And so Raphael not only knows the state that they're in can be broken, but he also knows that there's a potential for this to happen to humans as well, and he knows what Satan did, and so perhaps Raphael's the best person for the job to connect with them in this way, and we'll see how Raphael educates Adam specifically in Book 6, and we get more into that, Book 6, and really, I think, maybe to some extent, Book 7 and 8 as well, but you'll see how Raphael plays into the story more as we go through. But God commissions Raphael, and from lines 246 to 307, we get a description of his flight to Eden. And there's many allusions here, many references, many things we could pick up on, but one thing I wanted to pick on was, of course, just like explaining a reference to the Greek and Roman mythological tradition, as Milton alludes to that many times. Really, he doesn't go more than 100 lines often without referencing that in some way. So, one of the descriptions we get here in the middle of this passage, it's lines 285 to 287, it says, "Like Maya's son he stood, and shook his plumes, that heavenly fragrance filled the circuit wide." So, in Greek mythology, Maya is the daughter of Atlas, who is one of the Titans. He's the one who's charged after the Titans lose the war to basically... He's upholding the Earth, right? You've probably seen the statue of this really huge buff guy, like with a planet, like basically on his shoulders. That's Atlas. Like you've probably seen it at some point or another. But Maya is his daughter, so she's the oldest of the 7 mountain nymphs, sometimes called the Atlantides, and she's also one of the Hesperides, which is the keepers of Atlas's garden. And this is where, if you're familiar with like the myth of Hercules and like the 12 trials, this is where the golden apples are kept and where Hercules has to go to find those apples. But really we get in these texts that we have called the Homeric hymns, we get a lot of our understanding of like the origins of the gods. So there's 33 hymns and then one epigram within these, and they're called Homeric hymns because people think Homer may have written them. They're sometimes dated back to his time, sometimes later than that. It's kind of like Hebrews, where my opinion is like, who really knows who actually wrote this, and I'm okay with not knowing. That's sort of like critical, textual critical scholarship also, admittedly, is just not really much of an interest of mine most of the time, though it's important work and it helps us to understand things proper context. Just know that Homer may or may not have written these, but they do title them that way. And these were influential in some ways too, of course on Milton down the chain, but more in the classical tradition on Theocritus and Apollonius of Rhodes and the Alexandrian poetic tradition. But on the Roman poets, it was really influential on all of them, right? So Horace's poems, those of Lucretius, and of course Ovid, who in his Metamorphoses really gave us an in-depth text of the Roman mythology, which is similar to the Greek in a lot of ways, but different in others. And then, of course, on Virgil and the Aeneid and other things that he wrote as well. But within this, there's a Homeric hymn to Hermes, or Mercury, as he was called in the Roman tradition and in the tradition of the medievals as well. And this tells how Hermes was born of Maia after Zeus snuck down from Olympus to the cave of Selene and got her pregnant, which, if you read Greek mythology at all, you'll notice that Zeus gets a lot of people pregnant. He has a lot of affairs. He's promiscuous. That is, there's probably a lot of memes out there about that, to be honest. I've definitely seen them. But Like many others, Maya was born out of an adulterous relationship of some sort that Zeus had with a woman. And Hermes and Mercury wore a winged cap and feet. Then this kind of foreshadows Raphael in a way. So those are kind of like the connections that they're making. This is also just kind of an excuse for me to teach you more about Greek and Roman mythology if you don't know who Maya is, or Atlas, or even Hermes, or his origin in some way. So there we go. That's your illusion for the week. I try to pick at least one or two of those out in every overview video, and I hope that's helpful or enjoyable to you in some way. But moving on from that, not to belabor that anymore, we get to Raphael's arrival here, where he arrives to Eden and to the home of Adam and Eve, and really we get this hospitable sense here with Eve. And this is important to note, that hospitality is basically like a core, a feminine, essential feminine virtue in the classical tradition. You can see this some in the Eastern tradition, where if you go to a Chinese family's home today, like the woman of the household basically would like offer you a cup of water. And I know this because a friend of mine dated somebody of that culture, and he learned it from them, so I learned it from him. But hospitality is really it's just kind of like a universal feminine trait all across the ancient and medieval world in a way. I think it's probably something that should still be there today in a sense, and there's a lesson for us there. But Eve offers Raphael food, and I think in a way, like with all of this, Milton is probably pushing back against some of the Enlightenment idea, like the pre-Enlightenment ideas that were coming down the pike after his time. But I don't want to like get into that too much further. But Milton's also really kind of doing the same thing there with just the modernist ideas creeping in of his time that kind of pushed back on the tradition, and where somebody like Thomas Hobbes, who was a contemporary of Milton's, was an absolute materialist. Milton was part of a tradition known as Cambridge Platonism, which he went to Cambridge. He was Platonic in a lot of ways, and the Cambridge Platonists saw an absolute dichotomy between the spiritual and the material, whereas people like Thomas Hobbes just kind of cut out the spiritual completely, as far as I know. And materialism certainly was creeping in more and more in that time, and obviously it's going to be exacerbated through modernity, and as we see the consequences of that today in a lot of ways. But so in the Summa Theologica, question 51, Aquinas argues that angels are sometimes united with bodies, but that they do not have permanent bodies. So this is kind of that dichotomy between the spiritual and the material. And Milton is really ultimately, though, going against the dualism here in his own ways to show the continuity between the material and the spiritual, going against like the materialist conception here. And so we see that really aligned around lines 482 and 500-ish. But the bodily existence of angels and the bodily existence of man are related in a way, but they're not identical. So Raphael, in some ways, is going to have a relatable look to Adam, but not be identical to him. He's still going to be different and distinct in many ways. There's this idea, too, floating around that's been floating around at this time. And remember, like, from my last overview lecture, that people are talking about basically the beginning of humanity in, like, the pre-Lapsarian world, even in, like, political philosophy treatises around this time. But there's this idea that pre-Lapsarian humans were able to eventually achieve some sort of celestial state. Like, they would eventually be maybe like the angels or even the archangels in some way or another if they never ended up falling. And kind of another view of this is like Irenaeus, the 2nd century church father of Lyons, which is in modern-day France. Irenaeus believed that Adam and Eve were in a youthful state and that they did mature and were intended to mature, but they just never got all the way there, basically. So there is this idea floating around in the Christian tradition that humanity, one, was never supposed to fall in a way, but they might have even eventually achieved a higher state of being. Just kind of giving some context there, and it's worth noting. But Adam and Eve here, we see kind of a biblical parallel where they're trying to like entertain and really please and be hospitable to Raphael, just as Abraham and Sarah entertain the angels in a sense as well. And this brings up an important convention here because, a few decades before Paradise Lost, about 6 to 7 decades before, Shakespeare was in his prime writing all of his best stuff, right? And so in Shakespeare, there's this idea of using a biblical story as a narrative backbone. And this really pushes back against what, unfortunately, a lot of modern and postmodern Shakespeare scholars are uncomfortable with, which is the fact that um, whether he was really a super faithful and staunch Roman Catholic or not, people have different opinions on. But Shakespeare was influenced by Christianity, and he did like to use biblical literature as a backbone for his storytelling and for his dramas in a lot of sense. So Saul falling on the sword is sort of a narrative model for the second half of his play Julius Caesar, and his play The Tempest explores a fallen world in parallels to the Genesis story, and Milton probably picked up on that in some ways as well. But we're reading that here in a sense as well, with Abraham and Sarah connecting to Adam and Eve and how they relate to Raphael, just as they did with the angels. But we get another comparison here where Eve is compared with Mary. It's important to talk about because for those who either come from a Roman Catholic background, they might think that Protestants have like no sort of reverence for Mary whatsoever. And then a lot of evangelicals today, or just kind of broad non-Catholic or Orthodox Christians, are very nervous about Mariology in any form. But really the traditional Protestant view, and Milton seems to be picking up on that here in a sense, is that Mary was to be revered in a sense as in the Greek it's Theotokos, or the God-bearer, and this was affirmed at the third and fourth ecumenical councils, that Mary was the mother of God because Jesus is God and fully man. So we can say that, like it's okay to say that, and even appropriate to give that due diligence there in a way. But it shouldn't be as shocking in a sense that Milton gives these comparisons with Mary, though he would have never affirmed the full Mariology of the Roman Catholic Church by any means. So if you see that line in there, just know that there is context to that. And Protestants ultimately affirmed the Theotokos as well. That's just a lot of churches and cultures and Christian cultures today in the modern world, and have unfortunately just drifted from that. But that was a historic view in the church to have a reverence for Mary in that sense, which is different than the full Roman Catholic sense, whether you accept that view or not. It is what it is. So Raphael here is going to have a dialogue with Adam, and he's basically going to say ultimately that happiness comes from God and God alone, and that obedience is a free will choice that corresponds with happiness. So to be happy is to be obedient. To be obedient is to have happiness, or eudaimonia, like true happiness, not the fleeting pleasures that are often described in the pursuit of happiness today in our 21st century American society. But he says that man's will is perfectly made, but that it is not immutable at the end of the day. So we talk about like the divine immutability of God, that he can't change, but man's will can change. So he has the propensity to be obedient, just as he has the propensity to not be obedient. He can choose to sin, he can choose to not sin. He can fall, he can not fall. The choice resides with him, right? Like Raphael is saying, you have the responsibility to not fall and to make that free will choice. This is not something that you are predestined to do, where God is controlling your will and that you can't choose anything but to fall. Milton's mouthpiecing those ideas through Raphael in a sense here. Remember, Milton's pushing back on any sort of deterministic worldview that he encountered in his upbringing in his own time. Not to say all Calvinism is deterministic, but some forms of it certainly are. And, more moderate Calvinists, I think, would definitely admit that in a lot of ways. Maybe even some of the more extreme ones would too as well. But he says, freely loving is our will, and that we stand or fall based on our love for God, and that it's all about rendering due obedience to God. Like, love for God, happiness, obedience to him, they all come together. Like, they're not separate or distinct things, but they all work together for really the glory of God and the eudaimonia of man and the proper ordering of the cosmos, which the cosmos will be fractured and fallen in a sense if man does not do this. And so he says some have fallen, and this shows us that from Adam's perspective, he wants to know more about that. But Raphael here really challenges the notion of Satan, saying that that Satan said that they only love God because of their ignorance in a way. And Raphael is pushing back and saying, no, love and obedience are the ultimate reason here, and that one must choose this, the ultimate virtue in a sense here, and that one must choose to love and obey God fully, regardless of what they know or not. So as knowledge increases, and you could debate that it gets harder to obey God, or maybe it gets easier to obey God in some sense. There could be two different camps here. As you know and learn more, but Raphael says the onus is still on man to not fall and to trust and obey God, whether he's extremely ignorant like a little child, or whether he becomes like a wise philosopher king in some way or another. So Raphael's saying it's your responsibility to be obedient regardless of what I teach you, and I'm going to try to teach you well so that you don't fall in a way. So he's pushing back on Satan's idea here that, no, you're just ignorant, you're not obedient, you don't love God, you just don't know the truth. And if you knew the truth like me, you would fall just like I did. And there's a sense where, we can entertain or ponder whether Satan's right there or not as we read the rest of the poem. But does Milton make Christ subordinate to the Father in any way as we read lines 600 to 615? And I'm going to read that real quick because this is just important to consider. I don't think he does, by the way. I think there's different ways where we can kind of hash that out to see what Milton's actually doing here, but I just want to warn you because you might think Arianism, and I'll explain what that is in a second just in case somebody doesn't know, but this is important to consider because I'm claiming that Paradise Lost is not in any way unorthodox in terms of the doctrine of Christ, and I don't think it is at the end of the day, but let's read these lines really quick just as an overview. Hear all ye angels, progeny of light, thrones, dominations, princedoms, virtues, powers. Hear my decree, which unrevoked shall stand. This day I have begot whom I declare, my only Son, and on this holy hill. Him have anointed whom ye now behold, at my right hand. Your heed I him appoint, and by myself have sworn to him, shall bow all knees in heaven, and shall confess him Lord. Under his great vicegerent reign, abide united as one individual soul, forever happy. Him who disobeys, breaks union, and that day, cast out from good and blessed vision, falls into utter darkness, deep engulfed his place, ordained without redemption, without end. So at the end there, he's obviously warning him in a sense, and there's no redemption for the angels like there is going to be for man. But these lines here where he says, to this day I have begot whom I declare. So just think in the back of your mind, is he suggesting that the son of the issue here is, as the Son of God became begotten at this point in time? Is that what Milton is mouthpiecing here through this passage of poetry, right? Or is this from Satan's perspective? Is Satan just seeing it as there was a point where the Son got what Satan actually wanted, which was to be really the top dog in all of this? These are just things worth considering, and I want to discuss this more on Wednesday night, and not to leave you hanging too much, but I don't think it's Arian. I think it's either from Satan's perspective, or the rest of the poem might just even imply in some way that I need to explore more that this isn't an Arian idea, but that's worth exploring and discussing because obviously that can be really distracting if this is like heretical in some way. And just to briefly explain that in case somebody doesn't know, Arianism is a 4th century heresy. It's a deviation from the orthodox beliefs of the church. This comes from Arius, who lived from the 250s to 336 AD. And he was a presbyter in Cyrenaica, which is in modern-day Libya. And he held the view, it certainly seems through his theological musings in his life, he came to believe that Jesus Christ was not co-eternal with God the Father, but that he was the firstmost of creation. If this sounds a lot like Jehovah's Witnesses today, then you're right. It does sound a lot like Jehovah's Witnesses today. I don't know the history of their beliefs, but they're certainly influenced by Arianism in some way or another. But this was at the heart of the debates in the first two ecumenical councils. So the first one is Nicaea, that's in 325, and that led to the formulation of the first draft of the Nicene Creed. And then this was finalized in 381 at the Second Council, which was in Constantinople, which was really the center of a lot of the church and its theology and culture in the first few centuries. But the church affirmed the doctrine of the Trinity here, and I'm going to read some lines from the Nicene Creed, which is actually right there behind me, and just kind of give you like what they're saying versus what Arius was saying. So we believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial of one being with the Father. So basically it's saying that Jesus Christ is just another person in the one divine essence, which is God. So God has one divine essence, but three persons are fully that divine essence. It's a paradox in a sense, and if you're not comfortable with paradox, you need to become comfortable with paradox in a sense to be an Orthodox Christian, because there's paradox and mystery beyond our comprehension. That's a whole topic for a whole nother time. But Arius didn't see it that way. He thought that God the Father just was God, and then the Son was created. So he's not one of the persons in the Trinity. As far as I know, Arius didn't believe in the Trinity at all. I don't know what he said about the Holy Spirit. That comes a little bit later in the Creed. But nevertheless, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying Arianism, and isn't in Milton at all, and worth discussing later on. But moving on from that, so we get the end of this poem is really kind of Satan reacting to all of this. And so there's a cause of the war in heaven, and it's really this speech that begins at line 570 here. So I will read that for you all really quick. But he says, and this is a little bit in, but he says, "Yet for thy good is this dispensed, and what surmounts the reach of human sense, I shall delineate so, by likening spiritual to corporeal forms, as may express them best. Through what of earth be but the shadow of heaven, and things therein each other like more than earth is thought." So this is in the middle of like Raphael when he begins speaking to Adam, but he's really giving us this metaphysical relationship between the physical and celestial, which allows for analogical language and narrative. So God speaking truth into angelic time in a sense. But we quickly see in the story here that Raphael gives that Satan envies, just as Satan envies Adam and Eve in book 4, this is envy as his driving motive when he's in heaven as well. And this is the key here is the beginning of the Son. Again, that can be a confusing part, but at least from Satan's perspective, we know that he sees Son as the Son of God, Jesus Christ, as the highest. Whether that's Satan saw it as in creation or not, or was lying to us, I'm not sure. But Satan, in a way here, he's envious of the Son. That's ultimately really what leads to his rebellion. And so God the Father declares that the Son is anointed and that every knee shall bow to him. And so there's this feast and celebration in heaven. It's kind of like this heavenly version of Maundy Thursday, which is, in the liturgical calendar, we celebrate Maundy Thursday as the commemoration of the Last Supper in the gospel narratives in the New Testament. And so, like Judas on Maundy Thursday, who, in a sense, cannot bear the Eucharistic supper and the perpetual adoration of Christ. This comes from an essay that William B. Hunter wrote called Milton on the Exaltation of the Son, The War in Heaven and Paradise Lost, written in 1969. Google that and you'll probably find an academic journal that you can read. But he's making these connections where Satan is kind of like a proto-celestial like Judas, in a sense, where he's doing in heaven what Judas is going to do during the incarnation on earth. And so interesting connections there, but there's a blessing there, there's a feast, and we celebrate that feast in a sense with partaking of the Eucharist and liturgical feasts today. And just like Judas couldn't handle that and was pointing to betray Jesus, Satan was also pointing to betray Jesus. So there's kind of some typological connections there as well. Um, but interestingly enough, the angels here, they have the same test as the humans will have, and it's obedience. Will they obey or will they not obey? And we see here that Satan puts this to the test, and he begins working the crowd as um, he goes to this other region of the heavens. Not exactly sure how that works out, but Satan goes to this other region, and he basically starts working the crowd. And this is really similar to like the kind of the Satan just as a tyrant in general is kind of like reminds me of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh going out to this place, being surrounded by desolate Egypt, just as Satan is surrounded by his fellow angels in this desolate place. So not the heavens. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. But this reminds me of those passages of on Pasha by Melito of Sardis, where he says, "For Egypt was surrounding Pharaoh like a robe of wailing. Such a tunic is woven for the tyrannical body. With such a garment did the angel of justice clothe unyielding Pharaoh. Bitter grief and palpable darkness and a strange childlessness, the loss of her firstborn." And then he connects this to Christ as well in a different quote where he says, "This is the one who clad death in shame, and as Moses did to Pharaoh, made the devil grieve. This is the one who struck down lawlessness and made injustice childless, as Moses did to Egypt. This is the one who delivered us from slavery to freedom, from darkness into light, from death to life, from tyranny into an eternal kingdom." And so there's a sense where like Pharaoh being one of the major tyrants in the Bible is also like a type of Satan in a way. And basically we should be reminded here, as like when we analyze Satan's speech, that whenever our thinking is off and we think of God as a tyrant, we need to re-examine our motives and our hearts and readjust our thinking here. And so really here, Milton's view of free will is greatly tied to his views of tyranny and proper kingship, where he thinks that a lack of free will given makes God a tyrant. So just always remember that. I know I've said it before, but we have these connections, I think, with Satan and Pharaoh in a sense where they're both in a desolate place, and they're both, against God and working their people against God. But there's always opposition, those who remain faithful to God in the midst of opposition. And we see this with Moses. Moses is really one of the most prominent biblical characters in a sense here for the way he stands up to Pharaoh and continues to courageously and boldly try to reason with Pharaoh and enacting these plagues on Pharaoh and still showing up afterwards after the plagues, which you can imagine would be a scary thing. And Daniel does the same thing, right, with Nebuchadnezzar and like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they go in the fiery furnace and refuse to worship the idol. So the theme here is really Christian courage, the virtue of Christian courage as being willing to be tested in a way where actually putting your faith to the test and standing up for your faith even amidst conflict, even if death is going to be challenged here. So you might think of like the martyrdoms of like Saint Ignatius or Polycarp, which we have an account of in the 2nd century, where they were put to death by the Romans for their faith in Christ. So they are also types here in a way. But the types are all of, in a sense, this angel named Abdiel, who we get here. And Abdiel here really is our embodiment of Christian virtue. And in Northrop Frye's essay, The Story of All Things, which is about John Milton, he says this really about angels, Milton's angels specifically. "The angelic order is there to provide models for human action. They have superior intellectual and physical powers which man may eventually attain. But in Paradise Lost, they are moral models only. They form a community of service and obedience, often doing things meaningless to them, except as the will of God they have meaning." And then Frye goes on from there to cite 4 examples. Gabriel, who's the minister of responsibility. Raphael as a minister of instruction. Remember, he's Adam's teacher. Michael as a minister of command, who Michael's going to come in at the end of the poem, and then Uriel as a minister of vigilance, who we've already seen Uriel in book 3. But we get the sense where the angels are in Milton serve as paragons of Christian virtue. And he goes on to say of Abdiel, more important than any of these, this is Northrop Frye talking again, sorry, he says, more important than any of these for the theme of heroism is Abdiel, who remains faithful to God in the midst of the revolted angels. Abdiel, like many people of unimpeachable integrity, is not a very attractive character, but everything he says in the poem is of the highest importance. So remember here too, Abdiel is lesser than Lucifer, and this ties in with Satan's challenge where, oh, if I was just a smaller angel or a lesser angel, I would have obeyed. Abdiel is a lesser angel than Lucifer, but there's really a lesson here that it's better to be humble and lowly and obedient to God and just accepting and making peace with providence. It's better to do that than to have a massive capacity of being like Lucifer did, but to squander it and to fall, basically ultimately making him the biggest enemy of God, because now he has the biggest capacity, but his will is bent against God rather than being straight and perfectly aligned with God. And so I think there's a line too here from John Milton's work Areopagitica that really kind of gets at this well of Abdiel as a paragon of virtue. But he says this: I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race, where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. Assuredly, we bring not innocence into the world, we bring impurity much rather. That which purifies us is trial, and trial is by what is contrary. So really, we see here that Abdiel is a paragon of virtue because he has experienced and practiced virtue. But not just that, he's put it to the test. So Abdiel here, and we may or may not face this in our Christian lives on earth in a different sense, but Abdiel is given the ultimate test here. He's amidst the crowd, Satan's working the crowd, and the soon-to-be rebel angels are completely just eating it up. They ultimately fall with Satan. But Abdiel, despite nobody else doing this, he stands up and basically says, "You're wrong, Satan. I'm not buying that. I'm not going with you. You need to obey. Like, don't just tell him, like, don't do this. Like, you're going to fall. You're going to fail, and this is wrong. Just know your place in the kingdom of heaven, and be grateful for that, and align yourself with God." And so for Milton, I think we see this in that Areopagitica quote that I read, but heroism is grounded in being obedient to God, regardless of what others do. So others doing the wrong thing doesn't mean that they're right. Abdiel has to go against the masses here, and that's really the ultimate test, again, as we see with not just Moses and Daniel, but figures like Noah as well, or even like Enoch in a sense, though our description of him in Genesis is very, very brief. But that's really the grounding of heroism here. And so we really get a lot of this here with Abdiel. I think he's really the paragon of virtue for us, and he's really like a good classical educator would say, like, you know, virtue ethics is really the backbone in a lot of ways for how we read stories, right? Like, we need stories, we need models of virtue to inspire us to be virtuous. And that's exactly what Abdiel is for us. So if we're ever faced with a situation in our lives, whether it's just merely just being ridiculed by others for being a Christian, or in a scenario where we are challenged to be persecuted to the point of laying down our very lives in martyrdom, which was very common in the early church amidst the Roman Empire, we need stories of people like Polycarp, and we need stories of people like Ignatius, but we also need stories of people like Abdiel, and Abdiel is that figure here in Paradise Lost. He is our paragon of the virtue of courage, where his faith and obedience to God is more important to him than anything. Not that Abdiel is going to lose his life necessarily, but he has to be bold and courageous to stand up amidst angels who are more powerful than him, and to do that. And he gives this wonderful rebuke in lines 809 to 812, which I'm going to read real quick. where he says, one second, almost there. O argument blasphemous, false and proud, words which no ear ever to hear in heaven expected, least of all from thee, ingrate, and place thyself so high above thy peers. So he calls out the blasphemy right away, and we really see this parallel to Book 12 of Augustine's City of God, where Augustine says, and if we seek the cause of the bad angel's misery, we are right in finding it in this, that they abandon him whose being is absolute and turn to themselves whose being is relative, a sin that can have no better name than pride. So we see here that like Augustine is really in parallel with Milton here, and perhaps Milton even picked this up from City of God, which I'm sure he read, where regardless of what others are doing, Abdiel is rightly rebuking Satan, and he's standing for what is right, even if nobody else will. And he's a model for us, and I can't say that enough, but I don't want to belabor the point too much. But in the end, Raphael, being the good teacher that he does, he's relating this to Adam, right? This ties back in with that virtue ethics, where he's giving... We do this in literature. Like I'm a classical literature teacher, and one of my aims is to use these stories to show what is good, what is not so good, and what is bad to these 7th and 8th graders that I teach. And hopefully I'm doing the same thing well in this class for adults. But Raphael is relating this back to Adam, right? He wants him to get the point that, like, you need to be like Abdiel. Like, he's zealous for obedience to God. He calls out blasphemy. He calls out the pride. He listens to Satan's argument, but he rejects it in his unwavering resolve. And ultimately, he turns and he appeals to Satan to cease, for Abdiel knows that the consequences of this are devastating. And we see here, lines 845 to 48, cease then this impious rage, and tempt not these, but hasten to appease the incensed father and the incensed son, while pardon may be found in time be sought. So really, Abdiel warns Satan, and from Raphael teaching Adam, Adam knows that Satan fell, and he failed now, because Raphael's giving him the history lesson. Raphael's really a history teacher at the end of the day, which certainly ties in with the importance of history education in the Renaissance versus not being as much in the Middle Ages. But in a sense, we're like, it's not just literature, but teaching history, like we're parsing through the virtue ethics of different figures in history, telling history as a story in a way, and that's exactly what Raphael is doing here, and what he's going to continue to do in the next couple of books, especially in book 6. But I hope this was helpful and not too all over the place. Again, I'm trying to introduce a lot of concepts here, but our discussion on Wednesday night will really serve as where we get into discussing this as a class, and we're going to kind of get into answering the questions and discussing them together more. But I hope this was helpful in your reading, and really enjoying this time with you all, and I hope it's helpful, and God bless. Have a nice week.
All right, I hope that you enjoyed that as I did. If you appreciate this series from Josh, then I strongly encourage you to support his work by heading over to his Patreon, which you can find a link for that in the show notes, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening through the podcast. And as a reminder, both those options are available to you. Just look in the show notes for more information about how to get to the other one. And then, of course, if you want to join the Mythic Mind Fellowship and participate in all the various things that we have going on here, whether you want to just silently support our work, or you want to join our Discord server, you want to participate in our live chats, and every week we're recording something for one of the 3 podcasts. And so if you want to participate in any of that, become a patron at any tier over at patreon.com/mythicmind. And if you'd like to join us for our Silmarillion study, which is currently in progress, we're about halfway through, then just become a tier 3 patron for at least the next couple of months, and that'll allow you to finish out the course with us, as well as access all the material up to this point. But that's it for now. The next thing to come out from Mythic Mind will be actually released today over on Mythic Mind Games, as David and I talk about the Forgotten City and get into some philosophical issues regarding the nature of truth, reality, ethics, that sort of thing, while we talk about this game. All right, well, I will talk to you then.